Morning all.
Hi.
Good morning.
You're looking very pretty this morning, Sarah. Well, you're always pretty, but you're looking prettier against the flowers.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. They're over at Seeley's Gully.
Oh, nice. That's a beautiful spot, Seeley's Gully, isn't it?
Yeah. It was full of people over lockdown. You couldn't actually walk through it because it was a bit like it didn't feel quite good. Yeah. Right with so many people, but it was very popular.
It was a bit like the lake, I have to say. There were far too many people walking around the lake. Lots of cars parked as well, which shows wasn't really their neighbourhood, but anyway. So who is leading off this first part of the...
So it's stormwater, so it's infrastructure. Angela won't be here this morning. My understanding is it's a bit of an overview of stormwater issues following on from the stormwater bylaw discussion. And so I guess if we start with the staff presentation, and maybe do we want to leave questions till the end or ask throughout?
You chair it, Sarah. You can share this, and just however you want to run it, you'll get a feel for whether you hold it over.
Maybe if there's some natural kind of topic slightly changes in topic, we'll stop there and ask questions, then move on.
Okay,
so, cool.
I'm just going to confirm that Myri is just logging on, so she'll be here very shortly.
Yeah, cool. Councillor Sarah, I'm actually presenting today.
Right.
Oh, Emily.
Cool. Yep.
Emily. Cool.
Yep. Yeah. So I'll just start sharing my screen if that's okay.
Yes, thank you.
Right, can you see that? Stormwater management briefing?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. So thanks everyone for your time this morning. So our briefing today is obviously about stormwater management. The purpose of the briefing is to provide elected members with an overview of stormwater management, our strategic priorities, our challenges. Project Watershed is a bit of a topic at the moment that I believe that you've been talking about. We're about to redo our service level agreement, so we'll have a bit of a chat about that and get some guidance from elected members on what you'd like to see in that new agreement. Then I thought I'd take the opportunity just to put up the Nature in the City and Project Watershed, so you can see the objectives of those two programs and where the synergies and benefits lie with the two. And then if we have time, I can just run you through the capital investment profile, but that's just at a really, really high level. So we'll get started then. So here's a bit of a description on the purpose of stormwater management. Obviously our why is led by the National Policy Statement on Fresh Water. Then we've got the vision and strategy of the river, the Waikato Tainui, and then we've got our comprehensive stormwater discharge consent. So those three really dictate why we do what we do. Then we go into the how and how we carry out stormwater management in the city. We have our stormwater master plan, and that looks at our current and future stormwater requirements. We've got our catchment management plans, or ICMPs, which provide more detail on an area-wide basis of each catchment, and each catchment is slightly different to the next. And then we have our stormwater asset management plan, and those documents all talk to each other.
Emily, can I just ask a quick question on that?
Mm-hmm.
Just the NPS freshwater and the vision and strategy, because this came up the other day with the NPS UD. Are they both, because here you've got them equal, does one actually have a more hierarchy?
Well, the NPS is national and the vision and strategy is local. So we really need to put them both, I think, at the same level.
Okay, it was just a comment that Blair made the other day that the vision and strategy was actually would trump the NPS UD. So
it could do, yeah. When we put our relationship with iwi really, really strong, so there is probably opportunity for that to actually trump at some point. Yes.
Hey, Chris said, Emily, I think Lachlan's given a legal opinion to the
Okay.
NPS team that the vision and strategy does trump NPS.
Yeah,
Okay.
if I can talk to that, it most definitely does. In fact, it has the highest hierarchy of any piece of legislation in this suite, and it should be sitting at the top.
Okay.
It is under, just out of interest, sorry, Emily, just out of interest for councillors, it is also the vision and strategy is under review. It's at its 10-year review period. So that board is under the direction of the minister, considering how to review the vision and strategy. My gut feeling is that, it won't lighten up. It'll remain a strong document, or stronger even. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. And then we get into what we do. So on the left-hand side, we have our project Watershed, where we work with the regional council to deliver works in our streams and gullies. We have our stormwater asset renewal and capital works. We also have planned and reactive maintenance operations, and also sitting in that box too is obviously our capital delivery program. So we do have that, the new capital works as well. Then on the right hand side, we have our regulatory responses. So there's the stormwater bylaw, and the stormwater bylaw has its first birthday. Is it tomorrow or Friday, the 1st of October? It comes into effect. Then we have the district plan and the regional infrastructure tech specs. So that's how we design the tech specs, is how we go about designing and constructing new infrastructure. And that's we apply those through land use consents.
Yeah, you jump.
Oh, Chris, you might need to turn your video mic off. Thanks.
And then there's building code and also our building consents. So that's just a real brief summary overview on how we manage stormwater at a really high level.
Does anyone have any questions? I'm not seeing any hands. I'll check the hands every now and then, so just pop it up if you do have questions. Thanks, Emily.
And here's our strategic priorities for stormwater management. So stormwater assets are managed to protect people, property and the environment, and that covers sort of the LGA and the RMA. And these are in no specific order either. Restore and protect the health and wellbeing of the Waikato River and its tribs, so that's the vision and strategy. Then we've got provide sufficient urban capacity and infrastructure to meet long-term demand. So that's our NPS and the urban development. And obviously, as you know, our city is growing rapidly, so that's really important for us. And then reflect the values and interest in management of freshwater ecosystems. So that's your fresh NPS and freshwater management. Those priorities have been, I'm sure you would have seen them before previously, but I just thought I'd put them up here today just to show that we are always working towards those priorities. Is there any questions on those before I move on? So the next slide here is the challenges we're facing. I wasn't part of the discussion for the 10-year plan for stormwater, but I have heard that there was lots and lots of discussion and there was lots and lots of challenges identified. So I just wanted to put them up here today so you can see them in one spot. Apologies, I've repeated I've repeated a couple, but we'll just go through them and I'll tell you which ones are repeated. So the first one is ensuring that Greenfield areas have the right investment. The majority of our capital works program is for our greenfields. There's a significant requirement for us to support developers in that space. And also, if we're looking at our comprehensive stormwater discharge consent and the vision and strategy, we really need to making sure that we've got the right infrastructure in the right places for that. And that kind of leads us on to number 2, which is treatment locations and infrastructure to lessen whole of life cost and optimise land. So we need to balance whole of life cost, which includes maintenance of stormwater devices. As you can imagine, a rain garden has got quite a large amount of maintenance required against the opportunity to actually use those devices to protect the environment. So we do need to have lots of conversations to work out what is the best solution for each area. Then the next one down is the reflecting, acknowledging iwi values and the management of treatment of stormwater. Number 4 is securing and protecting overland flow paths. So a lot of these flow paths were traditionally in roads, but that also then creates a hazard. So now we're looking at, and we can't really, overland flow paths need to go with the flow of the land, and quite often these go through private properties. So how do we ensure that these overland flow paths are free from, gardens, anything that someone would build in the backyard, sheds, so that when they are needed, water can flow. But we also need to work with the residents as well, because the last thing they want to see is their nice garden being pulled to shreds by a small river running through their backyard when it does rain heavily.
Sorry, Emily, can I ask a question since you're talking about backyards just at the moment? I know it's not a massive issue, but there are still parts of our city, aren't there, when in heavy rainfall events, because of the full soil, the wet soil and the system, sewerage can come up onto people's lawns. Yeah.
So, So when that does happen, we work with the resident to clean that up.
I know too, but the point I guess I'm making is that in terms of resilience going forward, the system needs some work, because I mean, obviously going forward, having wet soil in your back garden is a nuisance, but having sewage potentially forced out of the system onto your lawn is a different thing. And so we have to work with the residents to make sure. And that's part of the older part of the city, having those smaller pipes as well, isn't it? Those smaller water pipes. And the open day Mountain East, and they've got clay ones like this, and the new ones are like that, aren't they? Big plastic things.
Yeah, and then it leads into how do we manage I&I, which is infiltration, stormwater getting into the wastewater system when it shouldn't be, and that's quite, as pipes age, they crack, and more stormwater can get into them. So yeah, absolutely, that's a big concern for us, and it's something that we're working on.
And can I just ask a funding question on that? Sorry, because I think it is pertinent. I don't know if anyone's here. In our long-term plan, we have upped the ante and put quite a considerable amount of investment into stormwater and into new wastewater upgrades, haven't we?
Yes, correct.
Thanks.
Maxine just has a question too.
Thank you. Just with regard to that, this week there was a Three Waters call with some of the Australian experience being shared, and one of the final comments from one of the presenters was the concern about permeable land and the ability for that to be protected. Is this what you're talking about? Because he was discussing the density increase in cities and the pressures on the city around that. So just your comment around that would be helpful.
So I missed some of that, but we're talking about the permeability of land and its ability to soak away stormwater.
Yeah, and with the increased density taking up more and more of the of the available land, we'll be faced with ongoing issues. And certainly if we're talking about being a growth city that's allowing more density, what do we need to do in order to protect those places?
So the way we manage development is we try to ensure that if it's a greenfield site, that the amount of stormwater runoff from that site is the same from when it was a greenfield to when it is developed. So obviously now when we've got houses on the rainwater can't no longer soak into the soil. So then how do we ensure that we still retain the stormwater on the site so we don't increase the flow off the site, because that then causes us problems in the streams with erosion, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of work in terms of detention, on-site detention. Obviously, in our hierarchy of solutions, soakage is our first option. So we try and soak as much as we can, but obviously there's some areas of the city with clayey soils where it's very, very difficult to get soakage. In other areas, it's much easier to get soakage. So there has to be a solution designed for each different area.
Thanks.
Emily, sorry,
yeah.
Max, just on Maxine's question. It's a good question. Just interested with our district plan, whether we should be considering anything there, or I guess any of our other technical specifications. For example, could we be requiring a little bit more permeable surfaces when people are developing a site, and therefore they might, then become a bit more innovative with using different types of surfaces, say for their hard surfaces, rather than just tons of concrete.
Yeah.
And tar seal, because some of these sites end up being both a concrete or tar seal desert.
Absolutely, and it is already in the tech specs and the district plan, but you're quite right, maybe we need to relook at that through the district plan review and see if we can improve it. Especially now, because I was involved in the last review of the district plan, technology's changed a lot since then, so we now need to look at it in a different lens to see what we can do when we couldn't do it 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, it's Andrea Phillips here, just jumping in. I've been doing some. Hi. So in terms of, you're asking amazing questions, and the permeableness of our sections really matters. So it's a really key thing. Regional Council are also hot on this topic. They've actually got standards which require rehabilitation of the topsoils through a 3-stage approach on our residential developments, to make sure that we have a percentage of all of our properties that can soak the water. So that's really critical to get the water back into the ground, to keep our streams full of water in the summer. So we have minimum requirements through the district plan, and we're working really hard to make sure that we have standard practice notes of how to soak that water back into the ground for all residential development through simple porous manholes. And we're actually engaging on a program to make sure we're monitoring those and that those are doing what they should do, because this is a really critical item.
Thanks, Andrea, because I recall when building myself, there were lots of requirements around basically, having tons of concrete driveway and things, and so a large portion of the site was taken up. And you also see other developments where they just scrape all the topsoil and then barely put it back. So that is it really the enforcement that's key there?
So two things is, I guess, what is pervious surface. Regional Council have now set the bar that is a 3-stage rehabilitation process if you want to say that your soil will take water. So it's potentially enforcement of that, which is not necessarily a Building Act requirement, obviously, but it's also what options have we got to reduce those big driveways. So we're looking at standardising permeable paving. We're looking at porous manholes in your driveway, which take your roof water and put it back into the soil underneath. So some really good options. We're through the district plan change, we're looking, things aren't confirmed through scope in that yet, but we're looking at, if you don't have a downstream stormwater device, what do you have to do on your property as a bare minimum? How much soakage and what sort of treatment, and what are easy, cheap, effective options to do those when you build your house. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Are there any other questions? Oh, no other questions at the moment. So
okay,
thanks.
Let's rock on.
Yeah.
Number 5 is retrofitting treatment infrastructure in the brownfield areas. So much of our older city doesn't have stormwater treatment. We just discharge straight into our drain streams and the Waikato River. So Andrea and her team have done a lot of work on this, and the estimate is that the total investment required to to improve our brownfield areas is 1.68 billion in the next 30 years. So a huge investment is actually required in this space.
Can I ask some questions on that? Sarah?
Yep, sure.
Definitely.
Thanks. So on that one is particularly interesting, given what we're facing with the Three Waters challenges, and the big costs that have been said nationally, at the moment around stormwater. It's how long is a piece of string? They've always said that they potentially billions of dollars worth of stormwater to come up, and the standard's not fully defined yet, like it is with drinking water and wastewater, right? So the government may up the bar, or do you think because we aren't going to be able to put as much unfiltered waste down our stormwaters going forward, are we? So this $1.68 million, which I presume is a local investment, then has that all provided for in the long-term plan? You've got it between years 11 and 30, but what provision have we got in the 10-year plan to retrofit some of our treatment infrastructure and improve stormwater filtration at this point in time? Because going back to, we still have to give effect to the vision and strategy, effect, which is the highest legal bar. So $1.68 million, have we got that money, or are we hoping to put it into a future plan?
So I can answer that if you like, because I helped put that request forward. So we put that forward. That's basically the untreated brownfield areas, which is about half of our city. We just priced that on rain gardens. Rain gardens tend to fit in a small pocket of area, and they treat around about 60% of phosphorus and 60% of nitrogen and those sorts. So you are still left with a residual amount of contaminants potentially entering the waterways. But they're best practice at the moment to hit targets that we have. The main target we'd like to hit long term is restoring our watercourses and our tributaries in line with vision and strategy. You're completely correct. Exactly what does best practice look like to hit that? It looks like a multiple of things, including treatment devices, riparian improvement, and a lot of things that all work together, which is not fully defined yet. In terms of our estimates, we chose to do rain gardens, which fit in small spaces, but they are expensive and not ideal. We are doing a little pilot study at the moment on Lake Rotorua as to options for looking at zinc on roofs, galvanized pipes and water, what sediment comes off the roads. Like just yesterday, we did some catch pit sampling from our sediments from roads, just to really look at a pilot study of what is entering, where's it entering from, and what are our cost benefits. Is more road sweeping on our really high roads a much better investment than rain gardens, which have high O&M? So we're looking at these options. In terms of what landed in the long-term plan, unfortunately, not much landed in the 10-year, but we certainly have the program there, and we have a little pilot study and a business case happening because we know this is coming.
So please would somebody supply me before the end of the day the amount of money that is currently in the long-term plan for stormwater? I would really find that useful. Just interesting. Because this is about...
if I can just flick through. Here's our forecasted expenditure for the 10 years.
Oh, okay. So hang on a minute.
And it adds up to around about 170 million, give or take.
So the unfunded is what colour? The grey.
The grey,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we have got a reasonably.
Can I just make the point, Mayor Paula, that this was sort of based on our hugs, and it's not really picking up on the NPSUD. So we're doing a lot more work now, as you know, as part of Iron's committee on the brownfield development and what the stormwater costs will be there. So if brownfield goes on steroids, these costs will go on steroids as well.
Yeah. So I just want to make sure that, so what you're saying, Chris, is that there's some money in the budget to get started. And, we were talking about rainwater gardens and some things like that might help. But there's a considerable bow wave of investment likely required 11 to 30 years. Is that what you said?
Yeah, I think you can see that that unfunded in years 4 to 10 as well. So like any good 10-year plan, you try and fund yeah, it's a good planning and some good work in the first 3 years, but there are challenges probably from year 4 to 30 rather than just year 11 to 30.
Thanks, that's very helpful. Appreciate it.
And just to follow on from that, Mayor Paula, here's a map showing where that investment is occurring in the city. So you can see the red dots are the future stormwater ponds. And then we've got some major swales up in this area as well. So you can see there's not a lot of work actually happening in the brownfield areas. It's just all predominantly in the growth areas.
Thank you. I don't want to dominate the questions, but just on that, given the information we've had a couple of times in the last 3 years about Watergate, I'm joking, about the wet parts of our city. Hamilton East got all those notices, you're wet, and somewhere else did too. So the fact that there aren't many red dots in the brownfields areas is potentially an issue, because that means they'll remain wet.
So this is just the investment that we're doing in the first 10 years. It doesn't include years 11 through to 30, which is when we're wanting to start looking at those brownfield areas such as Hamilton East.
So meanwhile, those will stay quite wet areas and under high flow. Okay, all right, thanks.
Thanks, Paula. Good questions. Ryan has a question too.
Thanks,
Ryan?
Sarah. Yeah, just on those, back to that, I suppose you identified the future Greenfields ponds, and I'm guessing with a lot of the brownfields, swales and ponds is less likely it's going to be more treatment devices. And I assume they're like a glorified sort of water filter, but bigger. Would that be right?
Andrew, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, sure. So our preference in Greenfields is a wetland. So a wetland is quite land hungry, but it's got 80% native planting, and it's those plants that really help take out the contaminants, and the large volume area helps attenuate the flows so that the watercourse receives a similar flow to what it would have pre-development. So that's our in the Greenfields, what a lot of our money is going towards and the developers have to build. You're totally right. In the brownfields, you don't have the land availability for big wetlands. We looked, there's about 7 locations in the city we could find where the pipes are shallow enough to create a wetland, but we'd have to think about buying the land, which is, as we know, very expensive in this day and age. So alternatives are the things like rain gardens or tree pits. So moving away from more amenity planting to purposeful stormwater management, which is still aesthetically green and has other objectives that our community desire. So tree pits, potentially rain gardens, but we would like larger rain gardens. The small ones we've seen on the side of the roads up in Rotokarri are difficult to maintain and very expensive and difficult to build. And we're moving towards putting some stuff at source. So can we get these porous manholes on all residential developments when everybody builds, and put something back into the ground there? Can reuse tanks off all new build help in these brownfield areas? So just doing a bit of a study at the moment on what is a good bare minimum on new developments in this brownfield, and then we'll have to polish in the subcatchment before it hits the watercourse, and where that is a worldwide problem for what you can fit in space that's affordable.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. I have one question just on that. The retention or detention tanks that are required for new properties to kind of slow, my understanding is that when there's a big deluge, then they kind of slow that release of stormwater. Have we looked at what would it do if all existing buildings, or at least in problematic areas that don't have these, that we installed them, say, on like a lease system? Like, would that be cost effective compared to other measures, or is that just actually less cost effective?
Great question, and I love you using retention and detention. They're two similar things. That's great. So retention is retaining the water so it never really leaves the site, and that is through soakage or a reuse tank. We capture our roof water and we use it to flush our toilets, cold tap in the laundry, and water our gardens. And studies show that could use up to 60% of your daily residential use. So that has a huge savings in terms of drawing water from the river, treating it and pumping it around the city. It saves operational costs. But when it's not raining and there's a drought on, those tanks are empty. So it doesn't help with water demand management or capital costs. So the other benefits are environmental. It's those small events, that frequent rain, that if it goes straight to the watercourse, that used to pond on land or evaporate to the sky, if it goes straight to the watercourse, it has a huge effect on the erosion in the watercourse. So slowing that first flush down. The first flush often also has the high contaminants. Your roof has been nice and dry with a lot of dust and phosphorus from your neighbour's fertiliser, and you get that downpour and that's high contaminant. So reuse tanks can take that first flush and divert it essentially into the wastewater through your laundry and your toilet, or onto ground if you're watering something. So they can be really environmentally beneficial for those. I don't believe we've done citywide modelling to show a wide-scale uptake of those in Hamilton, but I know other centres have, and would really need to start talking to the water master planners who have, they may have, just linking together on what would it look like wide-scale citywide.
Okay, thanks.
Environmental benefits, not water demand management.
Yeah, just a different way of approaching it. And one question from Maxine.
So in regards to that, I mean, it sounds really expensive. And if the city's being asked to pay for it all, then it's likely that, it will be a much slower progress than through other means. Is there a way that private citizens or that funding and financing can be found to assist with private citizens to be able to implement those kinds of things on their own properties and within their own footprint?
Great question. So there's been studies elsewhere to show that instead of maybe putting council paying for subcatchment development outcomes, would it be more beneficial to fund or subsidise reuse tanks on private property to get those same outcomes? So my advice would be that Hamilton would need some sort of study to understand the environmental benefits. We need to be careful that it's different to water demand management, and make sure that it would make sense, targeted rates or financial contributions. That has happened in some other areas. Whether that's right for Hamilton, I can't answer that question.
Cool, thank you. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, if there's no other questions, I'll move on to number 6. In terms of our challenges, is ensuring residents are aware of flood hazards and have an understanding of infrastructure design standards. So obviously when it rains heavily, areas of our city do flood. Andrea and her team have done some awesome stuff in terms of producing flood hazard maps over the years. I was involved with the first round of those many years ago. So it's actually enabling residents to understand what those flood hazards mean, and then also getting residents to understand what we can do in order to reduce the flooding. So that leads us down into our design standards, which is also linked into number 11 on the sheet there, which is our level of service. So how big do we design our pipes for level of storm, and then how do we manage the flooding if a storm was higher than that level of.
I think we've just lost your sound, Emily.
Service. Then we have number 7 is climate change. I guess we've all talked a lot about climate change and the impacts on stormwater infrastructure. Number 8 is management of private stormwater devices, and this leads reflects on something that Andrea talked about, where we're asking residents to have those permeable manholes in their private area. So we're really dependent on those manholes or those those stormwater retention devices holding back stormwater. So then how do we ensure that they're all in operation at all times? So it's fine when a new development gets built and everyone's bought their house, they understand, but in 10 years' time, the house may have changed hands a couple of times. Someone wants to put a garden shed or do something differently, and those devices are removed. So that's a big challenge for us on how do we audit into the future to ensure that those devices are in good working order at all times. Number 9, unfortunately, is a double up, so apologies for that. Number 10, changing legislative environment. You probably know this better than I do, but we've obviously got things like the NPS, we've got reform and RMA changes, which all impact onto stormwater management. And number 11 is our level of service. So our customers, through our consultation with the district plan, have said they would like to be protected up to a 1 in 100 year event. And our current level of service is a lot less than that. So obviously there's a bit of a disconnect to what our customers expect from us and what we can actually deliver. And obviously delivering to customer expectations would be extremely expensive for council. But then how do we mitigate their risk, I guess, is where we need to be working with them on that. Is there any further questions on the challenges that we're facing? Okay, I'll move on then. So Project Watershed, our agreement is due for renewal. It expired back in June. Staff are now working with regional council staff to actually reset the agreement. But just on the side, the work's continuing, so we're not stopping. We are working with them. We've got this year's program's already underway, but we obviously still need to get the agreement sorted. So there's been lots of conversations with elected members on Project Watershed. So I'd really like to engage with you now on and get some guidance from yourselves on how to future-proof the agreement, governance opportunities that you'd like to see through the resetting of the agreement.
Ryan, is that a new hand?
Yeah, new hand. Sorry,
Yeah.
Emily, just a quick question on the previous slide. Sorry, I couldn't quite get my mute off. But appreciate all that conversation around treatment devices and first flush, et cetera, all around residential. I guess there's also a challenge with commercial industrial and the roofs and that sort of as well. Is the thinking happening at the same time with that space, or is there any comment on any of that stuff?
Andrea, is that something you could answer in more detail than I could?
Sorry, could you ask that question again?
Oh, it's just with treatment devices on roofs, first flush and all that sort of stuff. I'm just wondering if there's been much, I know it's early days, but thinking around commercial and residential, like commercial industrial. I know like Main Freight, for example, they take the water off the roofs and they use it for truck washing and sort of try and, I guess, offer some sort of mitigation or sustainable re-water use. We had one yesterday, potentially in Innovation Park, that's looking at using rainwater as part of their water needs. But just in terms of that stormwater off those massive industrial roofs, any thinking on that?
Yeah, great question. So in the district plan, there's rules. And when you're 5 units or more, or 5 properties or more, or 1,000 square meters of industrial roof or more, or 300 square meters of commercial or more, when you're into that bigger realm, you have to do a water impact assessment. And there's a whole bunch of questions there around water savings and efficiencies, and what you could do that are different to what you would do if you did nothing, what the savings are. So I remember that Main Freight application suggesting reuse for their truck wash. And so there's a requirement to mitigate your flows back to pre-development. As Emily said, our level of service is it was reasonably low in our roads for our runoff. So what can a property do to reuse that water? So that's asked. Yes, reuse is a clear winner there. Other things are things like green roofs, but green roofs haven't really taken off. They're really expensive. You've got to get the loadings right for the buildings, but they're a winner in other cities, but not necessarily in Hamilton yet. But that means they sort of become neutral. The contaminants go into the plants and you can weed and replant rather than them running off into the environment. So the district plan has rules around what can and can't leave your property. And when you become a big player, like a large industrial unit, you have to do something. What that something is things like the reuse tanks, rain gardens, swales for car parking areas. It's about sort of getting that plant treatment to take the contaminants out. Once you don't have room for that, you're really under the ground with media and manholes, which doesn't add any aesthetic value, but you can maintain. And as Emily said earlier, that maintenance and making sure that maintenance really is happening. Otherwise, those contaminants are hitting our public network and our watercourses anyway.
There's a bit of work to do there for brownfield industrial commercial.
So Ryan, just as a comment, we're dealing with modern transport at the moment. So he's got huge desires himself for water reuse and some exciting prospects. So I think we're getting our development community coming to the table now, like Main Freight, wanting to do some of these things, which is really good.
Yeah. I guess what I'm trying to say is existing brownfield industrial commercial, that's going to be a challenge for us all.
Yes, and if they're not developing, how do you make them when they didn't have to do something 20 years ago? Yeah, we have a bylaw and we have other means to make them, but where's their incentive when they're been there for 20 or 30 years in retrofit? Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks. We don't have a lot of time left, so just in terms of the Watershed Agreement, Paula, are you still in the meeting? Because I imagine you might have some thoughts around this, and if anyone else has feedback, that would be useful.
I do. Thanks, Sarah. I do. I'm not quite sure what's happened. We spoke to, if you recall, we had one of our meetings with WRC, and I also wrote to them and suggested that since they changed away from their central catchment approach, having catchment boards, our ability at a governance level had been severely diminished to have any input or say. You have the surface level agreement, I get that, so they apportion a budget and staff under their technical expertise, etc., determine where to spend it or how it should be spent, depending what's going on with the river. But I still think, and I've mentioned this to Russ probably 4 or 5 times, we need an ability to talk about the amount of project watershed money that comes into the central catchment and how it's divested, so that we get our fair share of investment from that and that our issues are properly funded across the future. And I think there's a governance gap, Sarah. In fact, when we first set up, Margaret was representing us briefly, but then they abandoned all their catchment committees, and unclear how we bring this more regularly to our meeting. I see it said there's going to be strategy meeting every 6 months. Can staff perhaps tell me how the governance of this, how the councillors around this table get to have a say or get to lobby WRC for what they feel is necessary, etc.
So Mayor Paula, the conversations, you are correct. There are a couple of resolutions on our table to try and work with Regional Council. So Regional Council, through their governance structure, has discussed, even during the 10-year plan, that they thought the service level agreement was an opportunity potentially for that governance structure. So our question to you here today is that where you see that structure, or do you see the service level agreement as more of an operational matter and it's the governance structure is dealt with in another way? So
yeah. I think so. It used to be that way, Billy. So it used to be that
there was. Yeah.
and then once the quantum of whatever million was allocated for this stretch of river that went through Hamilton, then our staff were contracted to do that work because they had the greater knowledge of that particular stretch.
Yeah.
The thing we're missing now is that given that the watershed money is collected over a bigger area, we don't have any political input as to how that watershed money gets divided up across that catchment, what the priorities are, etc. I mean, I know you do it at staff level in format, but there's a gap there now where, I mean, if we wanted to lobby for some faster work throughout the city on stormwater because of the population, etc., coming into our catchment level, we wouldn't be able to do that because there's no political conduit for it.
Yeah, so I guess for us is with the conversations that we're having through the staff to staff channels on the service level agreement, the guidance we're seeking is, would you like just to have a paragraph in there that there is a governance structure that will be determined that's separate to the service level agreement for the sitting on the Integrated Catchment Management Committee? Because I know there is an opportunity. I understand Regional Council have formed a subcommittee of the other drainage areas, but the Central Catchment Committee subcommittee hasn't been reinstated. So I know that following your letters to Regional Council, there have been discussions and that the chairs are willing to do something. And so my recommendation is the service level agreement is almost an operational matter, and that there's maybe a clause in there in terms of having a separate governance structure confirmed outside of the service level agreement. But I think that that's something that we'd really like guidance
I
from
agree
you on that.
I'd like to hear from my colleagues as to whether you agree, but I think this would be a really good opportunity for someone like the chair of infrastructure or the chair of environment, or someone from those committees to pursue, in the same way that we're represented on other agency boards, to have a say at the highest level how we set, because they review Project Watershed at a much higher governance level.
Yes, they do.
And that's where we need the input.
Yes.
So we can lobby on behalf of staff of what we need for our stretch as well.
Okay.
So happy. Anybody else feel strongly differently from that? Because that's my view. I used to sit on it for years and years and years and years and years and years and years.
No, that sounded reasonable to me. Lisa, do you feel like you have clear enough guidance in that respect?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
My other question was on Project Watershed, with the next slide talks about nature in the city and Project Watershed and the mutual benefits. And I guess in the service level agreement, or you talked about a policy, are there any opportunities to kind of strengthen that relationship between the two? Because, I've raised, there were some concerns from, say, Tukutuku Stream Care Group and things in the past, where the way we approached the erosion control was detrimental to their restoration work and things. So it's just, and I know we've done a lot of work on that since. But yeah, just sorry, we're running out of time. But are we able to strengthen that at all, or is that just continue to be an operational thing?
I think because currently parks and the erosion control for stormwater are part of Project Watershed, so the two are already combined. So with the nature in the city now being a core focus for Hamilton City Council, I think it's a good opportunity to include that into the Project Watershed service level agreement and how we can enhance the relationships, particularly with our stream care groups, and those mutual benefits like Emily's put in the presentation here. And so I think that's where the Project Watershed, or I would recommend that service level agreement focuses on, so that we're delivering on each other's strategies and targets, but also protecting the the project watershed river management in terms of the erosion control, but I believe Hamilton City Council also needs to maximise the funding that we receive from Regional Council in respect to that, in terms of the funding from the ratepayers from Hamilton back into Hamilton.
Cool, thank you.
Right.
We've reached time, so if there aren't any more questions, I guess, are we okay? Emily, are we okay to move on to the next briefing?
Absolutely. The only thing we haven't talked about was the Nature in the City and Project Watershed, but we just touched on that briefly anyway. So you guys have got the slide there. You can see the difference in objectives and the mutual benefits of those two programs.
Cool.
And that's something we can bring back to the Environment Committee for direction on also in terms of that.
Yeah, and also don't forget I offered to bring staff from the Waikato River Authority to talk about how they fit with this. That action hasn't been progressed because we've got bigger fish to fry right now, but it will be before the end of the year, because I think understanding how we all play in this common space might be really useful. So that would be Julian Williams, who would come and talk on behalf of the WRA about the work they're doing.
That sounds good.
Thanks.
Thank you for the really useful and interesting briefing.
Yeah, it
Thanks
was, wasn't it?
Thanks for all your questions. They're great.
Exciting, did you, Sarah?
No.
Thanks, Emily, as always.
Right, thank you all.
Great work. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye. Now, who's leading the next topic on the briefing?
I am, Mayor Paula.
Oh, hi, Sean. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Yeah, chipper.
Are you happy for me just to kick straight into it, or did you want to take a break? Or
councillors, are you all right? You can get up and go over some coffee and keep going, eh? Yes. I think that's yes.
Marvellous.
Sorry, mate. I'm just trying to.
I will. I'll just share my screen. Thank you, Mayor Paula. So the purpose of this session is to give an overview of I guess the broader reform landscape. Obviously, there's an item coming to council tomorrow around Three Waters. That is part of I guess a broader suite of government reforms, and we wanted to just set some context around what some of those other sort of key items are and how we plan to approach them as a whole. I think for today, what we anticipated was that we wouldn't talk about the water specifically, but we would talk about the program approach. And get elected members' feedback and input into how we're planning to approach that. We also understand that elected members are quite keen to dig a bit deeper into the resource management reform particularly, so we'll probably aim to spend a bit more time talking about that, so sharing some of what we know so far, but also a good opportunity for elected member to ask lots of questions around that resource management reform. And the other kind of key thing that we want to get out today is just a discussion and sort of feedback and input from elected members around the role that elected members play in this government reform space. So how do we engage? How do we make decisions? How do we influence in respect of government reform? So I am responsible for sort of the umbrella, I guess, across these things, but we've got, with each of the different reform streams, have key leads within the organisation, and so different those sort of key leads will speak to those things. So in particular on resource management, Blair is leading that, so he and supported by his team will speak to that, and on Future for Local Government, Julie will speak about that, but sort of a number of others might sort of jump in. And just in terms of sort of questions, although we sort of indicated in the agenda questions and feedback towards the end, I think it makes sense to sort of ask questions and kind of have that discussion as we go. So firstly, just in terms of sort of some of that context setting in terms of when we're talking about government reform. On the left-hand side, you'll see there's a number of items listed, which are sort of key reform programs. We've sort of sought to classify those somewhat. So Three Waters, RMA, Future for Local Government, in that green box, and then housing. So with those, the ones in the green box, they sort of tend to tick kind of all three in that they are major central government reform. They do change the rules that impact local government, or the rules under which we operate, but they also have the potential to fundamentally change the structure and function of local government. So that's really where we think it's most important to concentrate our coordinated response to those. But it's also recognising that there are other in that orange box. So there's housing reform. There's also reform relating to climate change, particularly as the Climate Change Commission and the emission reductions plan that sort of results, and civil defence. So those things, again, are sort of major central government reform programs. They also change some of the rules under which we operate, but haven't got quite the same level of change for the structure and function of local government. And then we've just noted sort of education reform, tertiary education, health, DHBs, etc. And again, it's important to understand those for context, but we're not planning to sort of go into any great level of detail on those. So really the focus for us, we think, should be primarily on those first three, the Three Waters, RMA and Future for Local Government, but we will also seek to influence through the appropriate committees and channels those other items noted in orange. Pause there for a second. Sorry, actually, the other thing I'd sort of say. So, I will pause. Yep.
Sorry, there are a couple. Just my quick question is, in terms of any interconnection between those parts, like especially when you're looking at something like the RMA, right? And then you've got in the orange box housing. Now,
yep.
Whatever comes out of the RMA will have an impact on our ability to either streamline our housing approach or slow it down, or whatever. Climate change and the future of local government, the Three Waters and climate change are interwoven. So I'm just interested in how we maintain a proper oversight of how one thing influences the other. You may not have a comment, but that's my concern, because at the moment we do feel a bit siloed, not in our organisation, but the way things are coming at us. Let's talk climate change. Now let's talk stormwater. Let's talk housing. Now let's talk NPS urban development. Let's talk, it's all kind of more complex than that.
No, I think that's excellent point, Paula. And I think so in terms of how we, rather than deal with Three Waters as it's separately, as these other things start to come on stream and start to ramp up, we absolutely want to develop from a council point of view. I think our recommendation was that we develop our our position and our key messages about what we want for Hamilton, as a sort of from a top-down perspective, and then that helps feed into how we or what we seek to influence in respect of the specific bits of legislation or programs that the government is running. We would absolutely anticipate presenting information on housing reform and climate, etc., as part of that overall picture.
So that will always be the question when we come through the future of local government. What does that mean for our ability to deliver housing? What does that mean for us, in terms of resilience and safety? Thanks, Sean.
Absolutely.
Kesh.
Hi. Thank you. Sean, there's obviously a lot of reform happening. Are we keeping an eye on, the other reform programs, just in terms of what stage they're at, and whether there are any common concerns or common themes or things that we should be aware of in terms of where we're at?
Yeah, are you talking about things like health reform? Is it? Are they the
Yeah,
sorts of-
yeah, like health and education, things that have are further down the track. Have there been any major concerns in terms of, for example, with Three Waters and our governance concerns? Has there been any similar sort of issues raised with the ones that are further down the track?
Yeah, I'm probably not quite qualified to talk about concerns from the education sector, for example, on the education reforms. I think we're with sort of our probably have a kind of a watching brief is how we've described it, but I don't know that we are perhaps intimately across sort of all the specifics or the ins and outs of those particular reforms. I think where we would take a particular interest is where we see how they impact local government particularly, but these things do set the context for the city and the society in which we're sort of living. So I guess we don't kind of quite have the breadth of resource to be intimately across all of those things.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Paula. Thank you.
Thanks, Kesh. Sarah, I think. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Sean. Just really quickly, in terms of, say, the blue ones there, it could be useful just, I'm not over what some of those reforms look like in detail, but like, for example, with education, we have issues with schools potentially becoming bigger and more concentrated, which doesn't support our goals around a 20-minute city, or I guess there are aspects where that local knowledge or intersection could be relevant. So I wonder if we're able to kind of just at a broad level, at a high level, identify those potential intersections.
Yeah, yes, I will. I'll take a note of that, and I'll see what we can pull together to kind of give that context. I think the questions and the points that yourself and Kesha both raised are quite valid. So I will. I'll see what we can kind of get that sort of helps inform us on those things.
Cool. Thanks, Sean.
I don't think that's any other questions, so carry on.
So just in terms of sort of the why we sort of want to package these up and think about get involved in these government reforms, really kind of two things. So one is that we want to influence what central government does and influence for the benefit of Hamiltonians. So understanding and having a view on what we think is in the best interest of Hamilton, and really kind of advocating for that position to central government. And then the second aspect of this is understanding, recognising what those changes are and what they mean for Hamilton and for Hamilton City Council, and how does our organisation need to respond. So whether we are able to successfully influence or not in terms of what we think we want those changes to be, we still also have to plan and adapt to what those changes might mean. And so that means for what does our organisation need to look like sort of during and post reform in order to I guess operate in the sort of the new environment. So we have a transformation program and a transformation team in council, which Murray Hickey is leading. So that sort of second piece of it, in terms of what does the organisation need to look like and respond, that is sort of largely the sort of scope, the sort of domain of that transformation program. And then just in terms of so from a program point of view, just in terms of what we're trying to deliver. So firstly, that understanding of the effects of government reform, and noting this will be dynamic. So as more information is released, or as we understand more, as we perhaps do different analytics or community engagement, we kind of get a better understanding of what the effect of government reform might be. And that understanding is really important for helping us develop on that second point, which is what is our position on reforms. So if we sort of think about our vision and priorities for the city. If we think about what we believe is going to make the biggest difference for well-being of Hamiltonians, then we develop our sort of the key things that we want to influence the government on, and then it becomes, rather than simply reacting to government proposals, we can be a bit more proactive about seeking to influence government in the reforms that they are making. I'll just and then the communication strategy and communications for reform overall, but also sort of for each of the individual reform programs, that coordination piece as well. I'll just pause there because I can see there are some hands.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. I guess with regard to having a Hamilton-centric position, it might also be useful for us to explore that a little bit wider across a bit more of a regional view as well. How might we be able to do that, and what means would we use to get an agreed position? I guess it's not easy, but there could be some foundation principles that we would want to express to government, as a region.
Absolutely. I think there's on the next slide, there's a bit about different sort of partnership relationships, but I think it's a really good point to raise now, in that on some issues, we will want to take a Waikato position and present a sort of united front on sort of things affecting the sort of the wider region. That won't be the case for all things. There'll be some things where we might be more aligned to other growth councils or metro councils in our views on the world, and we might have a difference of opinion with, say, our surrounding rural councils. There'll be other things where other issues in which we want to partner or have shared views with future-proof partners, with Waikato Tainui and others. So what we are doing is identifying kind of those various stakeholder relationships that we have, and looking to set up or utilise sort of some of the existing forums that we have to develop shared views or shared positions on things, but also being really kind of open and honest about where we don't agree. And so we don't want to, we want to, as much as possible, present shared and unified views on things, but there'll be some issues where we have a view that is different from the regional councils, or we have a view which is different from Waikato Tainui, and we're all kind of just need to be okay with that.
Cool, thank you.
So sort of that next point kind of talks to that, is that the partner stakeholder engagement strategy is sort of talking to that as well. And we've kind of said develop and execute overarching influencing strategy and coordinating influencing plans for individual reform programs. So again, that's sort of how do we, and this is sort of where what role do various staff play, elected members, etc., in terms of how do we actually go about influencing those reforms. So we have a number of channels, which I'll sort of get onto on the next slide, but what role do elected members play in their relationships with MPs and ministers and others? What role do staff play in terms of taking part in reform programs, using submissions, those kinds of things?
Excuse me interrupting. Mayor Paula's just called. She's been kicked out of the meeting. She's just trying to re-enter, but we'll reboot her machine, I think, and then have another go. Sorry to interrupt.
Right, I think she's probably quite an important person to wait for.
I will keep an eye out for her, and I'll let her in as soon as she comes back. I'm not sure what's happened there.
Okay, well, so I have sort of discussed some of this in brief with Mayor Paula previously, so perhaps in the interest of time, if I'll just sort of carry on, and if we need to catch Paula up, we can do so. And then sort of those last bullet points, so the sort of coordinating the elected member forums, reports, decision making, we want to take a program approach to that. So I think what we've heard from elected members is having lots of individual presentations and reports and things on Three Waters and on resource management and on climate and on every other kind of reform thing can be a bit onerous. So as much as possible, we want to present and have that discussion with elected members about reform as a whole, and then dive into the specific reforms as is appropriate, given the timing of the government's sort of program within each of those streams. And so the bit I mentioned previously was around that the organisational impacts to be managed as part of the transformation program. And then this is probably my sort of last slide of talking at you. So apologies for dominating the airspace. But in terms of how we are sort of looking to manage this as a program, so we've got an internal staff governance group established, and as I said, so Blair leading the piece on resource management, Andrew on Three Waters, Julie on Future for Local Government, and then also key other staff representing strategy, communications, governance, transformation, HR, etc. I just want to kind of skip over the elected member piece and come back to it, because I just want to kind of talk briefly about these other bits before I sort of pause on the elected member piece, because I think it's worth having a bit more conversation around. The collaboration piece, so I've alluded to this already in terms of Tier 1 urban authorities, neighbouring Waikato councils, and we will align with some of these. Excuse me, the Waikato Tainui, LAS, UNASA, Mayoral Forum, and Water Reform Entity B. Blair, did you want to talk to some of those partner relationships at all?
Yeah, good morning, elected members, and thanks, Sean. So, and Maxine, I noted your comment before. So, as Sean has said, there is a great opportunity for us to align on all these various reforms with both councils of a similar scale and size to ours, the Tier 1 local authority. So that is the Tauranga, the Wellingtons, Christchurches, the Queenstowns, and Aucklands, who we have relationships with. But equally, through our strong relations with Waipa and Waikato, and also Waikato Regional Council, we are having ongoing dialogue, and we can certainly include that as part of our regular governance discussions. Regional Council have a work program looking at reform, and so we are, through Hannah's team, connected into that reform program at a technical level. The Chief Executives Forum and also LAS, or CoLab as it's now known, has a couple of work streams around I guess the strategic landscape and looking at the future. So again, through our connections, we're part of those discussions. So the key here is there are lots of different groups having conversations. We are well connected into those. We're ensuring that a Hamilton voice is strong. But in particular, I think that for us, our relationship with our Tier 1 local authorities is a really, really important one, because those are the councils that are similarly grappling with issues and thinking that is aligned with where we're at. So happy to take any questions on that.
I think, Ryan, did you have a question on something?
Yeah, so my question was more for you, Sean, on SharePoint, but we can come to that later. Or
yeah, I'm happy to talk to that now. If there were if there was no kind of questions on the stuff Blair was just talking about specifically, I'm happy to talk about that elected member piece.
Oh, look, just from a comms point of view, I don't know what your feedback's been. I particularly don't enjoy it. I don't think many other members are engaging with it. For better or for worse, from our point of view, and I don't speak for everyone, obviously, but I just don't know if it's going to be the best tool going forward for elected members, whether we need to test that a bit more. Be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, and I think perhaps, and I might, if Paul is back, she might like to talk to it as well, but just in terms of trying to get that balance right between the number of briefings and workshops that we have versus sort of how do we share information with elected members, apart from having to take up your time in a workshop situation or a briefing situation. I think the balance we're trying to get here with Exec Update was with the weekly email through Exec Update is actually anything, having a sort of a standing item on reform in there, so that anything that is new or news or sort of coming up or information we want to draw your attention to, we put it into the Exec Update, and if there's supporting documents, we put those in SharePoint and link through to them. So I know if everything just goes straight into SharePoint, I know it's quite easy to sort of miss them. So I guess the balance we're trying to seek is if we can use the Exec Update and the SharePoint folder together to try and get the balance that way.
Yeah, fair enough. It could be on me. I've struggled to engage with it, but that could just be me in training myself.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if me or Paula, I know we've had sort of lots of conversations with through governance and with the chairs, etc., around the number of briefings and workshops, and some frustration with how much elected member time is sort of spent in those. Was there anything kind of further that anyone wanted to kind of add or sort of comment on that?
I will make a comment on that, if that's okay, Sean. We are trying to rationalise all of that and focus on priorities. And I think, Ryan, part of the solution will be in lesser priority work being shared through different types of information sharing mechanisms. And I know there's a love-hate relationship with some people with SharePoint, but having other ways of reading the information and getting your feedback, digitalised ways, is one of the ways that we're looking at, isn't it, Sean? And I know even Murray's doing some work around that, about how we can share in safe digital platforms various things. Then we can align that with our own free time. But these big issues, and sorry, I did drop out and it took me so long to get the iPad back up and running. Some of these big things, this is where we've got to spend the time. I think we can see how critical it is to keep up ahead of because sooner or later, you're like we are tomorrow, we're in a decision-making meeting. So it's really vital that we start working at the very front end as much as possible. It's, unfortunately, comes with the job.
Sean, if I can just pick up on one point, Blair, here again. I think just with the collaboration, can you hear me? Yeah, is it just Paul?
Yeah.
So with the collaboration, there's obviously lots and lots of conversations happening across a number of different forums, and I guess that list shows that. From I guess our collective perspective, the more that we can speak with one aligned voice, and we can take a strong position or strong advocacy or strong or take strong direction to those forums, the greater our influence and our voices in terms of those reform matters. So I think picking up on what Sean's raising, the more that we can find ways to connect and have these conversations, both at staff level and at governance level, when we're in the Mayoral Forum, Mayor Paula or UNISA, or council-to-council discussions, or talking with our fellow executives and other councils, we have a very clear, articulate position on these various reform matters that we can advocate for. And I think Hamilton has shown that we have got a really good record of doing that well. So
yeah, I think one of the interesting things is, because I really like the way that the chairs of various committees are doing the collaboration within their portfolio, and I'm doing some of the Mayoral Forum ones and things like that. I think the thing I'd be interested in exploring, Blair and Sean, is how that person or those people are able to, in a timely fashion at the right level, feedback to the rest. So, for example, you know, Blair, because you sit next to me when I do it, I write into notes, a note function on the iPad, and as soon as I've finished that meeting, rough and ready as they are, bullet point notes as they are, I share them with my colleagues. It's not necessarily the most slick way of doing it. It's a way that I can say, I've been here, here's what I heard. So I think we need to think clearer about that, not leaving people behind bit where, you know, there's certain collaborators, and how do we then get that stuff down the pipeline? when we're all so busy. And that's all the chairs and anybody who sits on a portfolio of interest, and well, you're mute, Blair. I'm not sure if you were talking or just nodding.
No, I was just nodding, saying yes, I agree. And I noticed the chats around the executive update and other mechanisms to keep the information flowing quickly. So yes, I agree, Paul.
So if we can get Murray and the people we're working with digitally to have a think about how some of this can be streamlined in the background, if you like, then when we come together in person, we're really talking at the crunchy, pointy end.
Okay, sounds good. And then just the other sort of point on elected member engagement, direction setting, and decision making. The first bullet point there about council standing agenda item. So what we are proposing or anticipating is that we have there's a standing item at council on council agendas around reform. So to date, that's sort of been, we've had a standing agenda item on Three Waters reform. So what we would sort of look to do is expand that out to be the reform program, and then there's a place to capture any information or updates on each of those key reform streams, and to get elected member decisions, direction on relevant ones. So there won't necessarily be information on or decisions or debate on each reform stream every time, but we think it's important to make sure that we've got that placeholder there at council, so that we are, when we're talking Three Waters reform, or we're talking resource management reform, we're still kind of having that conversation in the context of the overall program of reform, because as many kind of elected members have noted, these things are all connected.
Okay, I agree, and I'm looking at some chat that Maxine has put up there is that point of remembering to tap into what local elected members are hearing and thinking, and because there are many sources of information is what I'm going to say. So thinking about that, I think, but look, councillors, to be honest, if you look at the suite of stuff that's up there in the reform package, that is fundamentally likely to change the way we do business going forward, one way or the other. So getting in and creating our future, not just responding to propositions that other people create for our future, is pretty vital in this space. And that's where I want to spend the time. Me personally, feel free to disagree, anybody. I can't, I'm speaking for myself there. No, everybody's happy?
Just to qualify the point that I made in the chat, and taking into account Blair's point around our connected messaging and being consistent across all of the collaboration points that and opportunities that we have. I think also it's really important that elected members have an agreed position on where we're going, and the best interests of Hamiltonians at the heart of that, but that of course there'll be some varying views, but that if we can also be aligned with that vision, I think that that's going to be really helpful in being able to take Hamilton's case further to government and give it the power that it really needs to be heard.
Thanks. Agreed.
And then that probably sort of is a good segue just into the last bullet point on that slide, which is the role of elected members. So I think we understand formal submissions, and Blair might like to touch on sort of some of the staff working in the various, with various sort of government ministries and agencies. But I guess I just wanted to kind of test with elected members the role, in terms of what role elected members have particularly in the influencing space. So we have elected members, represented on sort of various sort of forums, and some of those are sort of listed there, and Mayoral Forum and UNISA and kind of other things. But sort of beyond that, what role do elected members see them having in beyond sort of say decision making at council? And so I think decision making at council and on what our agreed position is. And in terms of how we sort of take that position to central government, do elected members have particular views on how that should be done?
Well, I do, and I do think it has to come through the portfolios. That particular chair represents that view alongside the mayor. It's been, and this conversation has come up before, we have to use a lot more tools, including Zoom, because getting down to Wellington, I mean, I've had probably, I don't know, James will confirm, but I've probably had 3 opportunities that I lined up, which I was going to talk with the various chairs about attending a trip a day to Wellington to meet with ministers on a variety of things. COVID hit that, kicked that into touch, to be honest. So now we need to look at how we reach out to ministers through written form, through Zoom, through inviting. I really like, Blair, what we do with Future Proof, where you're actually inviting them into an informed discussion, an informed and developed discussion. I mean, we had 3 ministers, Wood, Woods and Mahuta, all in the same, either in person or in Zoom, all in the same meeting about strategic growth for the sub-region and housing. That was pretty powerful. So I do think, you know, there's some ways we can improve on that. We do write to Wellington quite a lot by resolution of council, but having that more, getting them down here. By the way, just before anyone asks, we have got a date to talk with the MPs, all of the MPs like you requested, and we are working on getting those ministers that you have requested down here. Minister Shaw, for one, down here. They're not doing much at the moment. They're not going very far. They're really bogged down with what they're doing in Parliament. So it has been tricky. Anyway, Martin, I think I see your hand up.
Yeah. Look, you know, just want to re-emphasise it again. Invite people to sit in, as I did the other day on Future Proof, you know, through their Teams session. You know, those of you who don't attend that, it's a really excellent forum just to be a witness of, and that has huge buy-in from 3 ministers, which is excellent to see. They come in either in person or on Zoom, and just back up Paula, you know, what you've just said about getting ministers into town. And personally, given a previous life I had, if you can get a minister, if you can get the local MP to arrange for the minister to get into the city, that's in the end gold dust. But no, you're doing well on that, Paula.
Thank you. Anybody else got it?
Oh, just me.
Hi, Mark.
Hi. Just backing up a little bit to the elected member engagement piece. I was thinking about, I wasn't going to say anything, but I thought I should. The dedicated SharePoint folder, just so I'm understanding what we're talking about. And I like the way Sean explained it, where it was the executive update during the week, and then into SharePoint. We operated a one source of truth mantra at some of the businesses that I've worked at before. Is that what we're looking at, or am I off point? Am I off topic?
No, but you do make a really good point about the one source of truth, which we could explore further. The SharePoint is a way of putting written document and links to information with some guided questions, which enables staff to get feedback from councillors at any time within a window that council got free within a certain format. And then that might inform a workshop or a paper or whatever else. To be fair, though, Mark, not everybody loves it. So some people get on and use it and some people don't. It's like any digital platform. That one has not quite hit the mark for everyone, which is a shame. We don't all love it. And
okay.
So, and also, and I include myself in the ones that don't use it as well as I should because of the time factor. I have to find time.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. But the one sort of source of truth is a really good point. Have you got any ideas on that?
What was that? Sorry?
Do you have any ideas on that?
Well, I mean, I'm a fan of SharePoint, having used it in the past, so it gets a tick from me. but yeah, I mean, yeah, no, I've got really nothing more to add. I'd probably
maybe staff, is that something we can think about, how we manage that?
Yep.
That common messaging, especially where it's come out of, say, a resolution. So once it's out of a resolution of council, it is council's decision. It is their view, right? How we find and locate that in an easy way to talk with one voice.
Yep.
Sounds good. I've made a note of that.
Good thought. Thank you, Mark.
And Paula, just picking up on closing up the influence channels, I think, as we all know, there are many different ways to approach this, and we have to run many parallel processes. So there is absolutely conversations with government ministers and MPs, but equally there is, as Councillor Martin knows, when you get ministers, you get senior staff, and so you actually need to really, the relationships with the senior staff are critical, and finding those connections into those organisations, and in particular, lining up the different government agencies, because they you know, to the extent that they work individually, not collectively, is an important part of this. So the other thing is a voice that is potentially 2 or 3 mayors speaking the same thing at the same time is particularly helpful. And Paul, we've done that before, where future-proof mayors have gone and forced to Wellington. We've done things with Tauranga, Rotorua. So there's a combination of elected members at the governance level, but senior staff into senior staff in organisations, because ultimately we've got to influence the staff who are doing the work that finds their way through to the ministerial papers and bits and pieces.
I agree, Blair. I have to say it has to be for purpose, and I was having a chat with Sarah because I really support the idea of James Shaw coming down and understanding the work we're doing in green spaces and climate. So we've got to have something not out of the ordinary, but something significant to talk. We've got to frame it up. You can't just invite them up for a chit chat. They won't come. They're as you know, Blair, their officials will say, why should I bring the minister up here? They'll need to know more. What are you offering? What do you want? What's different? What's worth his time? They, apart from digging a bit of soil here and there and doing nice things, they do really maximise the use of their time. Anyway, no response to that is good.
That means agreement, Paula.
Okay.
Okay, so we're gonna if anyone's got any sort of thoughts after this in terms of elected member role and how best to engage elected members, or sort of what role elected members can play in influencing, then feel free to give me a shout afterwards or flick me an email, and I'll be happy to kind of sort of take that into account. I'm going to move on now to sort of doing a bit of a dig in to the resource management reform. So Blair is going to talk to this. I'm going to leave him to sort of carry it here. So Blair, it's all you.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And I've got a couple of friends with me. I've got Deborah Stanbarton and Hannah Windle, just to support with any comments and questions. So at the highest level, the resource management reform is the most significant change to the RMA since it was introduced in 1991. And this has all come from a report which was headed up by Tony Randerson, QC. So it was an independent review of the RMA, and they made a series of recommendations which the government had picked up on when it commenced the RMA reform. And there are, I guess, 3 distinct pieces of work in terms of the RMA reform, in terms of the pieces of legislation intending to be enacted, and they are listed as on the screen there. So it's a Natural and Built Environments Act, Strategic Planning Act, and the Climate Change Adaptation Act. So 3 very defined pieces of work. And I guess if you summarise it at the highest level, the Natural and Built Environments Act is the replacement of the RMA at the moment.
Correct.
And effectively, and we'll talk a bit more detail, effectively is the piece of legislation that replaces things such as district plans, regional policy statements, regional plans. So it is the mechanics of the RMA replacement. The Strategic Planning Act is effectively a new requirement which effectively replicates things such as Future-Proof or Waikato Plan, but at a regional level. So it requires a long-term regional spatial strategy, and it requires one for each region in New Zealand. So there'll be 14 regional spatial strategies across the country. And then the third piece of legislation is around climate change, and really addresses front on the issues of managed retreat and climate change adaptation. So basically how we, effectively links into the more recent government announcements around climate change and what we're doing to meet our overall, I guess, step changes to address climate change at the highest level. So these pieces of legislation are largely travelling a bit under the radar, would be fair to say. Most recently, the Natural and Built Environments Act, there was an exposure draft that was released, which we provided a submission on. But generally speaking, the visibility of this work is largely not high. And if I just step back and sort of look at what is this reform trying to achieve? And I guess the RMA in its sort of 30 years of operation, there's a huge amount of case law, a huge amount of decisions made around RMA, but the RMA, I guess in the view of the government, has moved away from what it was originally intending to deliver, and has potentially slowed down development and created a situation where it's a consultants and lawyers' dream, but effectively is not delivering on the original purpose and outcomes.
Correct.
So you'll see there on the screen, there are 5 reform objectives. One around giving effect to the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and second those is around climate change, natural hazards. The third of those is around protecting and restoring the environment, so a very core theme around that, which was always in the RMA. The fourth is around enabling development within natural environment limits with improvements in housing infrastructure, so obviously that's really relevant to us. And the fifth is improving system efficiency and effectiveness and reducing complexity. So in other words, how do we, I guess, progress things more quickly in a planning, consenting framework? That's probably the highest level. Now, if I just sort of step back and if we maybe just go forward a page. So there is some timeframes here. I guess the key one is the one that says Q1 2022. So sometime between January and March next year, the draft of the Natural and Built Environments Bill and the Spatial Planning Bill is intended to be publicly released. So that's a pretty aggressive timeframe. And the intention is that they will be passed into law sometime within the term of this government. So this is a fast process. Now, there was obviously an early version of the Natural and Built Environments Bill, which was released a couple of months ago. Council submitted on that, and Councillor Ryan and Deborah presented to the Select Committee, and I attended. And we gave some pretty strong feedback around the entire RMA reform to I guess, position Hamilton in terms of some of the wider matter that we're seeing relevant. But certainly you can see that it's a very fast time frame and with limited visibility to date in terms of the work that's been happening. As Sean has said, there has been some limited engagement with the local government sector and other stakeholders. There have been some panels where certain chief executives of councils have been involved in discussions. There is going to be an RMA steering group established, with the first meeting occurring any day now, which will involve some senior staff from councils and some elected members to start to increase dialogue with the sector generally, but limited visibility on that at the present time. So certainly at the highest level, our need to engage in this process is high. Legislation or thinking has been drafted as we speak, so the ability to influence thinking is significant. And I would note that in the case of the Strategic Planning Act, I have been invited into working more closely with the Ministry for Environment and some of the thinking there, which I think is particularly helpful on behalf of local government to bring some of the experience that we have from our future-proof work to bear in terms of thinking. I'll just go to the next slide.
Can I just make it a point on that? I know that Local Government New Zealand Council is of course been trying to deal with Three Waters reform right now in the shortest term. but they're already setting up, knowing that they should do better about this than we've all done collectively around the Three Waters lead up. I believe they're working through Jason and so on, a series of opportunities for elected members, hopefully some of which will be in person, so that around the country, sort of roadshows and other stuff, aren't they? That's what I understand.
Yes, Paul, and that's in line with there was an agreement signed between the government and local government New Zealand, which was pertained to the waters reform, but extended to the area reform. And so that's where this new steering group that's been established has sort of come from. I think the officials have now understood through a series of clearly delivered messages that they need to start engaging with the sector now on this RMA reform, particularly with the lessons of the waters reform, where the work was done and sort of largely done at an officials level with limited engagement with governance, that they need to actually take the lessons from waters and engage more early with councils at a political level, as well as officials as they're developing up their I guess legislative content and thinking.
Thank you. Just more letting councillors know there will be opportunities provided by LGNZ for them to tap into as well.
So this picture's a little bit hard to potentially read, but I guess it just tries to summarise what is in the public domain around these three pieces of legislation. So maybe if I start on the right-hand side, the Strategic Planning Act. So as I said, these will be 14. This legislation will mandate long-term regional spatial strategies, 14 of these across the country, and they will be set by some form of a joint committee, details of which are yet to be determined. But I guess if you think to the Three Waters conversation, it will be some form of similar structure that will sit across and determine the content of these regional spatial strategies. And the strategies will effectively outline at the highest level some of the major considerations in terms of development, growth, infrastructure, corridors, protection, timeframes, but also things such as coastal retreat and bits and pieces. So high level usage of land in a spatial context, but equally around determining where growth would occur and where growth wouldn't occur. So really, really important. And I guess probably if you look at future-proof and metro spatial plan as examples, imagine that on a regional basis set. They are going to be particularly important for us, and I guess particularly as a high growth area for us in terms of thinking about those important issues around our relationship with other councils in the area, how we think about and manage growth in the context of all the other matters that we're considering, but equally how this will be funded and delivered. So the regional spatial strategies, there's as yet undefined linkage between those and an implementation lens. So how will these be given effect to? How do we work as councils individually to fund and deliver against the regional spatial strategy? How do we as a council, I guess, feed into and then equally embrace, adopt, support a spatial strategy when they are determined by some form of a joint committee, membership of which is yet to be determined. So I think some of the themes from Waters will come through into this discussion here, and I think also who are the people, both at a governance level and at a technical level, who develop these strategies, and the role of the government as a partner alongside local government and iwi to develop these. So you can see a number of the experiences that we have from Future Proof will be particularly relevant here. But equally, for some councils who've been involved with the Waikato Plan and the journey of the Waikato Plan and some of the challenges of the Waikato Plan, we can see that when you work at a regional level and the distinct sub-regions within a region and the different challenges, there will be some quite interesting things to think about. Paula, would you like me just to pause there before I talk about the other side of the paper and take some questions, or do you want me to just to finish up the summary?
Let me see. There are a couple. No, my head's up. I'll take that down. There's one question from Max. We'll take that.
Okay.
Look, Blair, it's just by showing that picture there, it just strikes me that when we think of our own regional spatial area and then think about, some of the sub-regions within it, are we also being required to think about what sits outside of that and it abuts it, and the impacts that happen from our area that can get across to those other ones around the periphery of our of our particular region?
So, Councillor Maxine, if I share, I guess, some of the feedback that I've been giving to officials, it's exactly that point. So it is the inter-regional relationships. So take the Hamilton to Auckland or Hamilton to Tauranga corridors. So that's how do the spatial strategies at a regional level talk to other spatial strategies. The second piece of feedback is what about sub-regions and areas within the region? So Hamilton metro area, Hamilton to Auckland corridor, future-proof. Where do they fit into this framework? Because they don't currently. How is a tier 1 local authority such as Hamilton, which is distinctly different to any other part of the Waikato, how are our urban interests reflected here? How is high growth urban prioritisation of what we're trying to do, and the linkage to infrastructure and the linkage to the waters entities that they are established, or any other infrastructure entity, how are those given consideration in this framework, so that the interests of a tier 1 authority such as ours are not watered down or averaged out across the region, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and so that will be considering the kind of the hierarchy of priorities, etc.
Well, that's the question that I'm posing, but I think Paula or Martin or any other elected member who's been part of the Waikato Plan journey will know that there is always the trade-off risk of things being at a regional level. To find consensus, potentially compromises are made. And so I think this is going to be how do we ensure that the interests of each of the parties in the placemaking role of Strategic Planning Act and the Natural and Built Environment Act reflect the local needs and interests and priorities of those particular areas, whether they be a sub-region or a local area within a region, or where our region intersects with other regions. And I think if we just reflect on why do we have future-proof? It's because future-proof acknowledges that the Hamilton Waikato Waipa corridor to Auckland is distinctly different and needs special consideration different to the rest of the Waikato. And so we need to make sure that thinking is reflected in any legislative framework that is constructed here in terms of how this planning system is rolled out in the future.
Cool, thank you.
I think the second part of this is the left-hand side of the screen, which is the Natural and Built Environments Act, which effectively is going to be created around a national planning framework. So at the moment, we have things such as National Policy Statement of Urban Development, NPSUD. There's going to be a series of national planning framework, which is effectively central government direction on development and outcomes around the environment, around development, around water, and they will effectively set the framework and the permissions for what then falls into the natural and built environment plans, which are a plan which effectively again is at a regional level, developed by a regional committee. And again, is that committee going to be autonomous from councils? Is it going to be convened around the regional council? Is it going to be a representative committee? The question's unknown, but that committee again will I guess take that national planning framework and set the rules, which effectively are replacing the district plan, the rules for I guess any form of development consenting activity in the region. And that particular national planning framework and the natural and built environment plans should have a lens for a local authority such as ours, a tier 1 local authority, will have some recognition of the need for I guess a housing solution. But one of the things that we have noted is that there's no definition at the moment of built environment in terms of the legislation that's being proposed.
Yeah.
So the lack of a definition of built environment could be quite concerning for us as a high growth metro area, where urban needs in a city context are very different for those in a regional context. So I think councillors, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I guess at the moment we have a system where Hamilton City Council determines through our district plan, through a Hamilton Urban Growth Strategy, through Future Proof, we determine the rules and the framework and for our community. And they are obviously informed by government direction, by national policy statements. This model is going to flip that on its head, and it's going to effectively
it's going to force the government.
The government is going to effectively take a much stronger hand to enable and direct what is allowed and what is not allowed. I think under this framework, we will potentially see a lot less need for consents. So a lot more permission will be automatically enabled. So again, we need to make sure in an urban context, what does that mean? How do we think about our context?
Central direction.
And certainly a lot more central direction from the government in terms of directing. So if you go back to those earlier outcomes around the government wanting to see efficiency, wanting to see complexity being reduced, wanting to enable things, that will come with potentially a greater regionalised decision making. And so the voice of Hamilton, the voice of local placemaking will be a critical consideration for us in terms of how we think about our advocacy into this reform and how will it work in practice. So I might just pause there, Paula, because I've covered quite a bit.
Thank you. I'll just see if there's any questions. Doesn't appear to be.
Hey, Blair, I'll ask a dumb question. Just in terms of the relationship with central government, mana whenua. So so the proposal, talks about joint decision making, sort of collaboration. In terms of the degree or the sort of the mechanisms for that, how advanced or how sort of well thought through are they?
They are still at the early stages, Sean, and I guess my discussions with officials has been we need to look very, very closely at the lessons and the thinking from the Three Waters program of work, because it's a very, very similar consideration here. In fact, there's tremendous parallels here in terms of the governance arrangements and the voice and how the voice is considered here in the context of the treaty obligations. And so don't try and learn from the experiences of water to find a solution that will work. Very, very much the government are wanting to give strong voice to mana whenua. And I guess at the moment, under the current RMA system, mana whenua does have a strong voice, and we have a number of mechanisms upon which we give effect to that. This model, however, is proposing that mana whenua will have a voice at the governance table at the highest level, setting the rules and as a partner in the partnership sense, determining the framework and the development rules and the permissions and the spatial, the spatial strategy for the region for the long term at the highest level.
Yeah, and I just raise that because I know that it has been a conversation topic in Three Waters, so it's probably something that our council, our elected members, probably an area that we do want to influence in terms of how this plays out.
Me, Paula, I fear as though I haven't done a great job in talking about this from the lack of questions. The significance of RMA reform is massive.
I don't think that's the case. I think it is because it's so massive and so complicated, and we're at this big overarching level that people can't see the wood for the trees. I mean, we all feel a bit, you live and breathe this stuff every day. So I think the focus on reform is the right one. I think we need to probably get as soon as possible in the same room with each other, which we've done at Claudelands before when we've had workshops, remember, under level 2, where we can really start to talk at the broad level discussion. You're well past that, Blair, but councillors need to talk, like you said, at first principles. What are the sort of things that they consider important, and, you know, bring them all together in their head and in one place. That's what I think, because it, you know, it's really a lot. You look at a slide like that, it's a lot to take in. It's a lot to digest on a Zoom call. So that's what I'd suggest we do. And I know, for example, the local government reform, which we're talking about also, but not at this moment, is doing roadshows around the country and starting at that super high level. I think you and myself and James attended one. Was useful to get people warmed up and thinking and asking the right questions. So I don't know, councillors, have I got that wrong, or do you feeling that way?
Yep.
Mark?
Yes, I want to say, first of all, Blair, it's a great presentation. It's a great slide. And just because there's no questions doesn't mean you haven't explained it right. I thought it was bloody spot on. So well done. And then just backing up exactly what you said, Mayor Paula, is exactly how I feel. Same thing. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. And maybe, Paula, if I was just to stand back and summarise what I think are the matters of most significance for us to think about, and you can draw parallels to the waters feedback. Number one will be, what are the governance arrangements for this whole new form of RM reform? So, you know, there's going to be regionalised approach as opposed to local approaches for regional spatial strategy and a natural and built environments plan. So what are the governance arrangements? And then tied into that is, how is the Hamilton voice represented there? So that would be number one. Number two would be linked into that. As a tier 1 local authority, we have particular needs which are far more granular than what I would suggest is the case for a wider regional sense, particularly both rural and district councils. So if we think about right now, council, we have HUGS, Hamilton Urban Growth Strategy, we have Metro Spatial Plan, we have Future Proof, we have a number of things that are critical for us to help us think about our local placemaking as we want to transform our city into the city of the, you know, to capture all the aspirations. Where does that fit into this framework? Because that's critically important for us, that our interests are not lost or watered down in a wider regional sense. Then I think the third thing for me is implementation. How the heck is this framework then implemented, both in terms of a planning consenting sense, but more importantly, funded? Yes. And how does it link to our long-term plans? So again, how does a council feel ownership and ownership to invest against the regional spatial strategy that potentially you're one of 14 or 15 or 20 players that have had a voice in it? So, and then tied in with that is I guess, my view that we absolutely need to be heading towards a funding partnership agreement with government over the long term to align our investment with government investment. So this is Hamilton's going to invest in partnership with a number of government agencies to deliver a number of outcomes over the long term, not 1 or 2 years, but 10 to 20 years. So it's the implementation lens which links to our long-term plan and links to our infrastructure strategy. So for me, those are probably the three biggest areas of focus if I was to theme them up.
Thank you. Just in terms of how do we get involved at a governance level, I have reached out to local government New Zealand and the president of local government New Zealand as well, suggesting that I'd be more than happy to be involved in any governance advisory thread. There may be others amongst us who'd also, but as a member of the governance and strategy group, I could be useful in that space, and I'll put my hand up for that. We can't do anything in this term of politics, but I do really strongly urge us to consider putting a Hamiltonian on every one of their advisory groups up in Wellington next time. There's the governance and strategy. There's also the policy advisory group that I was on for 7 years, and we could usefully use someone sitting in that seat as well. So We've just got to be tenacious and tell local government that we've got good people that want to sit on those seats, who want to be in those conversations. So if councillors sitting out there want me to advocate for them to be part of a working group on something, then I'm more than happy to try and do that. So I just need to know where the will is.
So is it an action sort of coming out of this that if elected members do want to put their hand up for sort of those, is that sort of through you, Mayor Paula? Is that what you're suggesting?
It has to come through me, through the metro sector, but also because I sit on those other groups. I don't, and from a staff point of view, it's helpful to know when they're thinking of putting this or that kind of advisory group together, because we don't, I'm not on National Council. Jim sits on National Council for Zone 2. And so unless he alerts us to these opportunities, I might not know that they're looking for people. But, I've been on a couple in the water space, of course, but I'm more than happy to have other competent and careful councillors to consider, it's good. One of our really young councillors from Christchurch, Lan, does a brilliant job on some of these spaces.
And I think we'll take that as an action as well to identify any opportunities that we see from our perspective that might be sort of relevant and applicable for elected members. And just
wow,
sorry.
Look at that rain! Can you hear that rain? That's putting our stormwater to test. Carry on, Sean.
It's beautiful sunshine here. And just those, and I think just to sort of go back to those sort of three kind of themes that Blair was talking to, that's when we're sort of talking about establishing a council position and sort of key messages that we want to advocate for. I think Maxine made the point earlier that actually getting agreement as council on what our positions are, that would be sort of where the benefit of something like that at a council meeting and council resolving on some of those high level position statements and messages, that's really helpful for then we can speak as council. This is a sort of agreed council position, or these are sort of agreed themes that we want to advocate for. So I think those kind of themes that Blair talked to are really good ones as the starter for 10.
I agree. Has anybody got any questions on that, or are there any other actions that council? No, there aren't. Everybody's quiet today.
Okay, Blair, are you happy that we move on from the resource management piece now?
I think I've said everything. Thanks, Sean. Thanks.
Okay,
Paula.
Cool.
Just one other comment. I have a conversation with you, Ewan, if you are on this one offline, because of course you have, and Angela and I have had that commissioner training, which adds some value in my view, because that gives you a good understanding of the framework. Okay, cool. I don't know if he's there. Yes, he is. Good.
Okay, so we'll sort of move on now. So we as I sort of said at the start, we're not going to talk to the waters.
Sorry, Paula,
piece.
I wasn't ignoring you. I am here. I am listening to you. I was away from my screen for 30 seconds.
We're all listening, Paula. We're all listening.
No, it's all good. I just can't see who's. Thanks, Ewan. Thanks, Marvin.
So waters is obviously on the agenda for tomorrow, so we're going to leave that for tomorrow, and we're going to move to the future for local government piece, and I'm going to invite Julie to talk to this.
Thank you, Sean. I'm sorry, my video is not working, councillors, so you'll just have to hear me rather than see me. So the Future for Local Government review is one of these the government review packages. At the moment, there's not a lot of information out about it. There has been a terms of reference issued, and that's on the DIA site, and a review panel established. The terms of reference talks about the review will examine the role, functions and partnerships, representation and governance, funding and financing. but no more detail than that. If you look at some of the drivers that they talked about that have sort of influenced the need for the review, they talk about the Productivity Commission's report on local government funding and finance, the Waitangi Tribunal's report to ensure treaty relationships are provided through local government, Climate Change Commissioner's advice to government on climate change, the sector's direction for certainty about long-term direction for local government, calls for placemaking, active citizenship and inclusion, strengthening the role of local government in participation and governance, and open, transparent and connected democracy. So quite a long list that they've sort of got floating around in the background there that I assume the panel will be using to help form up the more detailed terms of reference. We are expecting to get that, or the panel is expecting to deliver that back to the Minister by tomorrow. We understand there will be some time before, most will be a couple of weeks before it comes out to the sector. And then the next big date is they basically have a year to work on this review and then issue a draft report on the 30th of September next year, with the view of that going out for consultation. We, of course, would like to think that there will be some influencing points in between there, but again, we don't have a lot of information at this point. Happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions? No. I think just to remind councillors, I think at the strategic day that we're having, we are replicating in some way the first roadshow that the local government commissioners did, that Ewan and I attended in Ohaupo. So we're going to go through that. So that was very, very, very high level. Seems to me, Julie, I don't know if you've got a comment on this, that, you know, when you go to a roadshow and they say, what does local government presently do well? What do you think it could do better? And that's kind of the basis, I think, of that workshop, which is very useful questions to ask of a board. But we're going to have to move quite blinking fast, right?
Yes.
We've got to go past thinking about that and thinking about the new purpose of local government, etc., with all these other bits in the puzzle that we were talking about before, Sean. You know, all these other things going too. So what does it mean? So my concern is that we really do need to give this pretty swift attention and fairly.
Paul, I guess my comment to that is, and it underlines why I think the current three water reforms are so misaligned and fragmented, that future of local government review should come first. And out of that would have fallen a number of things. I enjoyed our first chat with the group who are empowered by the government to commence this local government review, but I was left with the feeling that they weren't quite as interested in hearing our views. They had a number of predetermined strategies, but that would be the only comment I would make, that inherently the fault with the local government review is that they've somewhat started in one action prior to completing the other.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who would share your view. I think they did on the day, Ewan. And it was supremely high level compared to what we're dealing with. And there you are, James. Wasn't it? It was completely high level compared to what we're dealing with the water, free waters.
Yeah, that's right. And you're right that we are going to be doing a session on this at the retreat, on which councillors look out for an email later today. Yeah, we were hoping with the timing of the retreat, because they're supposed to be publishing this interim report by tomorrow, as Julie said, we were hoping we would have that next level of information to kind of inform our conversation on Monday, but we've now been told that the interim review won't actually be published. It will go to government tomorrow, but it probably won't be published for another week or two. So it probably will just be a fairly high level conversation based on the fairly small amount that we know so far, as Julie said.
A couple of points, Mayor Paula. I think, as you've commented, the reforms that are happening out of water reform and RMA reform will have a significant impact, especially on the Local Government Act, and particularly around the purpose of local government. Having said that, though, I think as a council, this council's been really focused about our purpose being to improve the wellbeing of Hamiltonians. So I think we're maybe well advanced in terms of that in relation to some other councils. So we're already having a lot of our conversations centred about improving wellbeing. But I think it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And just one comment I have to staff, and I wonder, feel free to disagree, councillors, is I think we've got, you might not think we have really, but I feel we have got a unique opportunity to craft what we think really best practice might look like in the local government space. We can actually step in and be leaders in this thinking. We don't always have to be responders. And I would like whatever facilitation and expertise brought to the task of seeing how we develop our leadership as thinkers at a governance level as well. Right? I don't know if anybody agrees or disagrees with that. And if they do, they're not going to say anything today, Sean.
My default position is if no one says anything, they wildly agree, Mayor Paula.
I might take that on board tomorrow, but I suspect not.
Sean, I don't know if that's a workable or plausible position to take, to be frank.
Hey, Sean, one of my previous directors at a place I worked at, he said silence is acceptance.
Yeah, it's how I sleep at night.
Yeah.
Well, for the record, I'm not being silent, but I have nothing to say.
Okay, so that was, thanks everyone. So that was essentially the content of the briefing session, and so the kind of there's sort of that intro to the resource management and kind of starting to land some of that initial information. I appreciate kind of it's the first time sort of hearing it for many, and so it might take a few more sessions or sort of documents and things like that to kind of sort of start working through kind of the implications. In terms of next steps, we've got a briefing scheduled for the 24th of November, and they will start through the exec update and the SharePoint site prior to that, start sort of sharing information and updates sort of as we go. As soon as we hear anything about the future for local government scope, we'll also put information together around that. I've taken sort of a few actions as well around information around that context around the education and health, and also sort of various other kind of notes and things to follow up on. So that's unless there are any sort of final questions, that is it for the session. So I'll just kind of do a quick check before we kind of sign off to see if there are any sort of final thoughts or questions.
Let's look. No, surprisingly, no, not today.
Okay, marvellous. All right, thank you everyone for your time.
Brilliant, thanks councillors. I can't remember what this afternoon, but thank you for that. Really good, good information. We all look forward to when we can be together and talk and converse and share ideas.
Thanks, Paula. Thanks, Sean.
See you all.
See you all.
Well done, guys.